The isolated campsite. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a chance for me and my friends to escape the hustle and bustle of our daily lives in Boston. We'd planned this camping trip months in advance, choosing a secluded spot in the White Mountains, a place where we could enjoy nature without the interruptions of city life. The idea was simple: set up camp, go hiking, and spend evenings by the campfire. We packed up our gear, loaded the SUV, and set out on a Friday afternoon, eager to disconnect from our routines and reconnect with the wild. When we arrived at the campsite, the sense of isolation was immediate. The area was surrounded by dense forest, with towering pines and the faint scent of pine needles in the air. The campground was rugged, with uneven ground and a small, clear stream running nearby. The sky was overcast, casting a gray light over everything, but it wasn't enough to dampen our spirits. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, ready to enjoy a cozy evening around the fire. As night fell, the forest around us came alive with sounds: crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, amidst these familiar noises, there was something else. Every so often, a strange, intermittent sound would pierce through the night, like a muffled scream or the distant cry of an animal in distress. We brushed it off as the wild calls of nocturnal creatures, though none of us could quite identify the source. The next morning, I went for a walk along the edge of the campsite to explore the area. While trekking through the underbrush, I stumbled upon something unusual: an old, rusted canister partially buried in the dirt. Its surface was covered in grime, and it seemed out of place in the pristine wilderness. I showed it to my friends, and we joked about it being an old relic from a bygone era, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, while we were hiking on one of the trails, we noticed a man in a worn-out jacket standing at a distance, watching us intently. When we tried to approach him, he quickly turned and disappeared into the woods. We shrugged it off as a local hiker, but the encounter left us with an uneasy feeling. The man's presence was too coincidental, and his sudden disappearance made our nerves fray a little more. As dusk approached, we returned to our campsite and noticed something alarming: footprints leading right up to our tents. They were large and bare, like someone had been walking around our site without shoes. We hadn't seen anyone near our campsite all day. We checked our gear and tents, finding everything seemingly undisturbed, but the footprints were a haunting reminder that someone, or something, had been very close. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I saw a faint flickering light through the trees, not far from our campsite. It looked like a lantern or a flashlight, but it moved erratically, as if someone was wandering aimlessly. My friends didn't see it at first, but when they did, they also became concerned. We decided to investigate, but as we got closer, the light suddenly vanished, leaving us with an eerie darkness and growing tension. The next morning, we were shocked to find that a significant amount of our firewood had gone missing. We had stored it neatly beside the tent the night before, but now there was barely enough left for a small fire. We searched the area around our campsite but found no trace of the missing wood. The only explanation we could come up with was that someone had taken it. But why? Throughout the day, we became increasingly on edge. The missing firewood and the strange light kept us on high alert. We discussed whether we should pack up and leave early, but we were reluctant to let our fear ruin the trip. We tried to focus on our activities, but the paranoia lingered in every conversation and glance. It felt like we were being watched, though there was no concrete evidence. That night, as we prepared for bed, I found a note pinned to one of the trees near our tents. It was crudely written with shaky handwriting: "You shouldn't have come here." My heart raced as I read the message out loud to my friends. We searched the surrounding area frantically, but the forest was still and silent. We decided to lock our tents and stay close together, our minds racing with fear and suspicion. The following morning, the tension reached its peak. We packed up our belongings quickly, our desire to leave overshadowing our need to enjoy the rest of the trip. As we drove away, we glanced nervously at the forest, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. The drive back to Boston was filled with uneasy silence, the memories of the weekend a chilling reminder of our encounter with the unknown. Back in the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't entirely over. We never learned who the strange man was, or who left the threatening note. The unsettling experiences at the campsite have stayed with me, a constant reminder of the eerie and unsettling possibilities that lurk in the wild. Every time I hear rustling leaves or see a flickering light, I'm reminded of that weekend, and I can't help but wonder if the danger is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting camper. The silence in the pines. Every summer, my friends and I would escape the chaos of city life for a weekend in the serene woods of New Hampshire. We'd pack our tents, camping gear, and enough snacks from the local Walmart to last us. This year, we chose a spot in the White Mountain National Forest, a place we thought was just far enough from civilization to be relaxing, but still within reach of emergency services if needed. We arrived early Friday afternoon, the sun shining through the trees and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. The campground was perfectly secluded, with only a few other campers scattered around. We set up our camp, laughed about past camping mishaps, and planned our hikes for the weekend. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. It was just as relaxing as we'd hoped, until a strange noise broke the tranquility. At first, it sounded like a distant, rhythmic thumping, almost like someone was hammering something deep in the forest. We exchanged uneasy glances but shrugged it off as the sound of someone else's construction work, or perhaps an animal. The noise came and went, always returning in the dead of night, growing louder each time. Despite our attempts to ignore it, the persistent thumping was unnerving. The next morning, I woke up early to make breakfast. As I was setting up the camp stove, I noticed that some of our gear, including a cooler and a few camping chairs, were missing. I thought maybe one of us had moved them without realizing, so I called out to my friends, but no one had seen anything. We split up to search the campsite and the nearby areas, but there was no sign of the missing items. The thumping noise from the night before was forgotten as we focused on recovering our belongings. The whole situation seemed bizarre, but we were more focused on finding our things. Later that day, while hiking on one of the trails, we encountered a man who seemed out of place. He was dressed in worn clothes, and his gaze was unsettlingly intense. When we asked if he needed help, he mumbled something incoherent and quickly turned away, vanishing into the trees. His behavior was odd, and we couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching us. We continued our hike with a sense of unease, the earlier noise and missing gear weighing heavily on our minds. By evening, the sense of dread had crept back in. We had settled around the campfire once more when we noticed that a flashlight had gone missing. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something or someone was taking our things. We decided to stay up and keep watch, hoping to catch whoever was responsible. The thumping noise began again, louder and more insistent, like someone was trying to make their presence known. We heard rustling in the bushes and saw shadows moving, but every time we checked, there was nothing there. As the night grew darker, the thumping became relentless, and our anxiety turned into outright fear. We were on edge, each of us jumping at every little noise. Around midnight, one of my friends, Jason, went to check the perimeter of our campsite. When he didn't return after a long time, we called out for him but received no answer. We searched the area with flashlights, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. The silence that followed was deafening and filled with an eerie sense of foreboding. Panic set in as we organized a search party, spreading out and calling for Jason. The forest, once comforting, now felt like an impenetrable maze of shadows and whispers. We used our phones to light the way, but the coverage was spotty, and the GPS signal was weak. The thumping noise had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow our calls for help. Each passing minute intensified our dread, and the thought that something terrible had happened to Jason was almost too much to bear. As dawn approached, we regrouped at the campsite, exhausted and frightened. We noticed that the thumping noise had stopped, and the forest was eerily quiet. That's when we discovered a hidden stash of our missing items in a hollow tree nearby. Among them were personal belongings of Jason, including his phone, which was smashed beyond repair. It became clear that someone had been targeting us deliberately, and Jason had likely stumbled upon them. Our fear was now mixed with a deep sense of betrayal and anger. We continued searching, this time more methodically, hoping to find any clue that could lead us to Jason or explain what had happened. While investigating a nearby creek, We found fresh tire tracks and strange, muddy footprints leading away from our campsite. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, and the sense of being followed grew stronger. We were no longer just camping. We were caught in a sinister game, with no idea who or what was orchestrating it. Just as we were about to give up, we came across a small, abandoned cabin in a clearing. It was the same cabin where we had seen the strange man earlier in the day. The door was slightly ajar, and the air around it was thick with an unsettling feeling. As we entered, we saw signs of recent activity: dirty dishes, a makeshift bed, and disturbing drawings on the walls. The cabin was a horrifying reminder that someone had been living here and watching us all along. Realizing we were in immediate danger, we fled the cabin and made our way back to the campsite. We packed up our remaining gear in a frantic hurry, our minds racing with fear and adrenaline. We drove out of the forest as quickly as possible, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of pursuit. The thumping noise had ceased, but the feeling of being watched lingered. We vowed never to return to those woods, forever haunted by the events of that weekend. Weeks later, the police investigation into Jason's disappearance revealed nothing. The cabin had been abandoned for years and no trace of Jason was ever found. The missing items were never explained, and the thumping noise remained a chilling mystery. To this day, I can't help but feel that something sinister is still out there in those woods, watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to cross its path. The night at Pine Lake. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I had decided to spend a couple of days at Pine Lake, a secluded spot about 2 hours from the city. We had rented a small cabin that looked like it was straight out of a postcard. The cabin was nestled among towering pines, with a beautiful view of the still water reflecting the overcast sky. The plan was simple: a break from the grind of everyday life, complete with fishing, hiking, and just enjoying nature. As we arrived, the crisp, cool air and the scent of pine made me feel like we were miles away from our everyday stress. The first evening was everything we had hoped for. We cooked s'mores over the fire pit and laughed as we shared stories from college. But as the night wore on, I noticed something odd. There was a distant sound of a car engine, which seemed out of place given how remote the cabin was. I shrugged it off as someone passing by on the main road, though the sound continued intermittently throughout the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, but when I looked out the window, all I saw was darkness and the occasional glimmer of moonlight on the lake. Around midnight, as we were winding down, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. We all froze, glancing at each other in confusion. None of us were expecting visitors, and the idea of someone being out there in the middle of nowhere seemed unsettling. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door cautiously, but there was no one there. Just a stack of leaves blowing in the wind and a sense of eerie quiet. I closed the door and locked it, but the knock had left an unsettling feeling that lingered. As we tried to settle down for the night, whispers started drifting through the walls. At first, they seemed like the wind rustling through the trees, but as the whispers grew clearer, it became evident that they were voices. Soft, almost indistinguishable words that seemed to come from right outside the cabin. We huddled together, trying to stay calm, but the whispers continued, growing more insistent as the night progressed. We decided to ignore it and hoped it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. The next morning, we noticed that some of our camping gear was missing. Our fishing poles, a cooler, and some food supplies had vanished without a trace. We were baffled. We had left everything secured the night before. We searched the surrounding area but found no clues. Our only guess was that a wild animal might have taken them, though nothing seemed disturbed or out of place around the cabin. The missing items added to our growing sense of unease, but we decided to continue with our plans. That evening, as we were preparing for dinner, a strange light appeared across the lake. It flickered like a lantern being carried by someone, but there was no sign of a boat or any movement. We watched it for a while, trying to figure out what it could be, but it just hovered there, unmoving. The light eventually disappeared, but its sudden appearance and eerie stillness left us feeling unsettled. We talked about it around the dinner table, trying to come up with logical explanations, but none seemed to fit. That night, the knock came again, louder and more persistent. This time it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. The sense of being watched was now overwhelming, and we decided to stay up in shifts to keep watch. We heard the footsteps moving around the cabin all night, but every time we checked, there was no one there. The feeling of paranoia grew stronger, making it hard to relax. As dawn approached, we were all on edge, exhausted from lack of sleep. When we went outside to assess the situation, we discovered a strange, unsettling discovery: a note pinned to the front door. It was written in jagged handwriting and simply said, "You're not alone." We were all shocked and terrified. Who could have done this? The idea of someone deliberately trying to scare us was almost worse than the idea of a wild animal. We decided to pack up and leave, but the cabin's remote location made it difficult to do so quickly. While we were in the midst of packing, one of us noticed someone moving among the trees at the edge of the property. We tried to get a closer look, but couldn't make out any details. The figure seemed to be watching us from the shadows. We grabbed what we could and rushed to our cars, but as we loaded our things, we heard a loud, abrupt crash coming from the cabin. It was as if something heavy had been thrown or had fallen inside. Panic set in, and we hurriedly finished packing, not daring to look back. The drive back was tense. We kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us. The unfamiliar terrain and the sense of being pursued made the drive feel endless. Every time we stopped for a rest, we felt the same nagging sense of being watched. The sun finally rose, and the road became familiar again, but the fear from the night before lingered. We all agreed that something had been terribly wrong at Pine Lake, but we didn't fully understand what. Back in the city, we reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found no evidence of any criminal activity. They dismissed it as a prank, but we knew what we had experienced was more than that. The missing items were never recovered, and the note was never explained. The cabin was soon rented out again, and while we were relieved to have left, the events of that weekend left a lasting mark on us. To this day, we avoid talking about that weekend, but the memory of Pine Lake still haunts us. Every time I pass a secluded area or a remote cabin, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. The thought of being watched, of someone or something lurking just out of sight, has left me with a deep-seated fear. Pine Lake was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but instead, it became a reminder of how quickly the safety of the familiar can turn into something terrifying and unknown.